Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Toby Brunzowski, who's co-founder and chief strategy officer at Lamasoft. And today we're going to talk about tariffs, trade, and the global supply chain. Now, supply chains face many risks and disruptive forces today, and one of those that's in the headlines, particularly today, is the threat of new tariffs on the global arena. Now, why should supply chain executives care about this new threat? What actions should they take to respond effectively to this threat? And what capabilities are required from a people and technology standpoint, to make sure that they're able to respond and adequately address all the different what-if questions that companies should be looking at today. Well, those are just some of the questions we're going to address in today's episode, and it's great to have Toby back in the program, who is on the front lines of this topic day in and day out with, there at Lamasoft and with the companies and customers that he works with. So Toby, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adrian.
So Toby, like I said, a lot of discussion today about the potential for a trade war, based on the tariffs that the U.S. is threatening to implement against China and other countries. And then, of course, those countries are threatening to, implement retaliatory tariffs on us. First question, why does this matter to supply chain logistics executives?
Well, supply chains are pretty complex systems, even in the best of times. It's a lot of partners, and they're all over the place, right? It's not like it was even 20, 30 years ago, where you basically had a lot of the supply chain under your own control. It seems like more and more of it is outsourced. And it is, from the sourcing, the manufacturing, and even the customers themselves that you're serving are in, a completely global market. And as a result, things are moving across borders. And when things move across borders, they're subject to costs. And, when you're managing and executing a supply chain, or a business for that matter, I think one of the biggest costs that just about every business has is the supply chain cost. And if you're going to stay in business, you have to be profitable. And so these supply chains in many cases are, a really kind of fine balance of all of these different elements, all the different costs, right? There's costs around your labor and your sourcing and your logistics and all of those different things. And so anything that, fluctuates or varies can mess with your margins, can mess with your profitability. And, even things like just up and down fuel costs and commodity prices or currency valuations, just minor things like that sometimes can, take the supply chain that you had balanced and optimized and put it out of whack. And then you add something like a 20, 30% tariff on top of that for, some of your major supply. And, you can imagine what kind of panic that causes.
I think I love that phrase. It is a delicate balance, right? Because you are trying to balance. Obviously, cost is such a big, factor. One of those elements you're trying to balance. And there's so many components to cost, right? There's labor, there's sourcing costs, there's the tariffs that we're talking about here. There's taxes, raw material costs, transportation costs. The list goes on. And then you've got to balance that with, the service requirements, which is becoming more and more challenging, for companies today. And then obviously quality and everything else. And, you work so hard as a supply chain executive to create that perfect balance in terms of determining, where you're going to where you're going to source from, where you're going to locate your manufacturing facilities, where you're going to put your distribution centers and so forth. And then something like this happens, like a threat of tariffs. And if and when they get implemented, can throw that whole balance off, and you're kind of back to the drawing table, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, what it does is, with this one, along with anything else, when you run supply chain, it's like constantly these questions, right? These what if questions of, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if we introduce this new product? What if we decide to go after the e-commerce market? What if we decide to offer next day service, right? Or, and then there's just these new things like, what if this tariff actually, is implemented? What is that going to do for me? And so, the thing that's interesting, I think, for customers is how do you address all those questions, and how do you do it in a rapid enough pace that you can actually stay ahead of them, or at least respond, at a pace that is on par with your competitors. And so, really what this has led to, which honestly has benefited us, is the idea that you really need to have a digital twin, like a digital model of your supply chain, really, that represents that physical operation and all the complexities, right? All the policies that govern how that supply chain runs, all of the different costs associated, who you're sourcing from, where you're stocking things, where you're making them, where your customers are. And if you can do that, if you can have a near real time or a real time digital model that kind of shows you what's going on, what you have is a sandbox, right, where you can experiment and try new things and test out, the impacts of any of these changes and see, what's going to happen and predict that in the digital world without, being exposed to the risk of actually doing it or actually being, impacted by it. And so I think that is really where companies are moving towards, is, putting this type of a business process and a capability in place.
So it sounds like that's kind of the first step, is trying to, kind of create that digital twin, if you will, that sandbox that you talked about. But it seems to me that, gathering the necessary data, for companies to then create that digital model of their supply chain is a big challenge. I mean, that's always been kind of that whole data quality and gathering data. Is that your experience? I mean, and how are companies overcoming this challenge?
It is the challenge everywhere. It's the it's the $1 billion solution that everybody is looking for. Yeah, the reality is, you have so many different systems to help you, execute and run your business, right? So you have ERP systems that are kind of the transactional repository for a lot of the the key orders and product information and all of these attributes about your customers and suppliers. Like you have CRM systems to even add on top of that. You have transportation management systems and warehouse management systems that help you kind of execute the supply chain, right? And then, on top of that, you have all of these third-party reference databases that are helping feed you information like tariffs and global trade management requirements and all that stuff. And so there's a ton of different systems. It would be great if somehow, years ago, somebody had come up with a global standard for everything, but that doesn't exist. And, even two people that are both using the exact same, SAP, ERP footprint or whatever, they're implemented completely differently. And within any organization, the idea of just having one of those is pretty unique, right? So I think the main thing that takes up the most time with our customers and everybody else is coming up with a mechanism and a way to have as close to a single source of the truth as possible, right? A consolidated, blended view of that end-to-end supply chain. And interestingly enough, I mean, we, set out some 15 years ago to create some technology to help people model their supply chain, right? And we created this data model that represented all the different elements within the supply chain. And we found that every time somebody went through the process of creating a model, it was like eye-opening, and they could see, sometimes for the first time, they could visualize the operations, they could see how things were flowing, they could see historically what they had done. And it's a lot of heavy lifting, but if you do it right and you focus on this not being a one-time process or one-time project, but a continuous process, you do things a little bit differently. You focus on the master data management and the plumbing and the ways in which you blend that data together. And if you do that right, what you end up with is something that can be pretty much continuously refreshed from all these different systems so that you have now that place to go to as a reference.
Yeah, so it sounds like, and this is going to lead to my next question, really talking about the role of technology and people and all this. But from a technology standpoint, obviously technology has continued, to evolve, and certainly the tools that are available today and kind of the approaches that companies are taking today from a technology standpoint is facilitating, if you will, this data problem, right? In terms of being able to bring this data together, cleanse it, have it, this whole master data management approach to things. And now you've got things like APIs, and you've got just a wider variety of data sources out there, more real-time data that's also coming into all this. So I think it sounds like, that if you architect a solution right and leverage some of these, I guess for lack of a better term, data aggregation and cleansing tools effectively, you can get to that data problem that we talked about, much more effectively today than you could, let's say 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, and what we found, what's kind of fascinating to me is that a lot of our customers they went on this journey where the first step was just, hey, I need to create this model. I need to solve a specific business problem, whether they're going through an M&A, or they need to quickly reduce working capital, or they have an expansion plan that means they're going to run out of capacity at a certain time. They just need to address something. There's an event driven approach to having to redesign the supply chain. Um, but but then when they answer that one question, they realize, well, there's five others that are right behind it, and the list doesn't end. And so then they start to go back and they say, I don't want to do this whole thing again because that was so painful. And so they come up with their own, through heroic efforts and a whole mix of different technologies, ways to come up with this consolidated, blended source of the truth. They'll stand up a SQL database and they'll use a bunch of Access and SQL queries, and they'll use ETL tools like, Informatica or something, or they'll set up a SharePoint drive to, give people access to the information. They do all this stuff using all kinds of different technologies. And when we looked across our hundreds of customers and we started to do assessments of this, what we were realizing is everyone was just a little bit different. They were all going at the same problem, but they were doing it differently. And we kind of said, you know what, this is an opportunity, right? There's something that's still missing. And so, in order to do that, we realized there was another level of technology, data blending and data consolidation and visualization that was needed. And, for us to do that on our own with our own kind of, growth trajectory and resources, we couldn't do it, which is one of the reasons why we took on an outside investment. We thought we had an idea. We thought we had the basic building blocks to make it work, but we didn't have the capital to make it happen. And so that was where we put some money to work for us. We had some really good investment resources, and a few years later, we're now bringing this platform to our customers, and it's amazing like how quickly you can shrink the time between question and answer if you can just solve that one problem and do it in a way that is kind of sustainable, as opposed to these kind of patchwork skunk work projects.
Right. I mean, I think what I find very interesting is, and I think part of the reason why in general across supply chain domains, this whole data quality or data management piece has always been a challenge, is it's not, for lack of a better term, it's not really sexy, right? I mean, it doesn't get the same kind of attention as a specific application type, right? A transportation management system, a supply chain design solution, right? A warehouse management system, you name it. I mean, those are the applications. That's what people put RFPs for, right? That's what people are buying, right? We're not realizing that, the Achilles heel or the foundational cornerstone to make those applications really work effectively, you've got to really address that data management, that data quality piece, first. And I think, fortunately, I think today, people in the industry are kind of recognizing that. Kind of to build on the technology piece. I mean, I think getting now towards the kind of the sexier applications, if you will, the supply chain design and network optimization and so forth. I mean, I think that I think there's a lingering perception, because these applications, these solutions deal with such complex questions and problems, is that you need a PhD in operations research or mathematics to leverage them effectively. And I mean, is that perception, a reality? And from a people standpoint, I mean, what's the typical background of the people using these solutions today?
When I got into this industry, that was the norm, and there were a lot of companies. The ones that were the leaders were the companies, and you can name off some of them that were the more recognizable, whether it be an HP or a P&G or a Kimberly-Clark, or some of these guys that had these operations research, R&D groups that were building their own applications that were solving really complex problems. The team of data scientists. But what's fascinating is that the pace of change and the amount of volatility in the market that has been occurring has been basically, requiring a different approach, because, to be a data scientist and to be presented with a problem, you're going to sit there, you're going to think about the problem, you're going to take the tools that you have, and you're going to build a solution. You're going to build a solution to solve the problem. But there's a time and there's a latency associated with that. And the solution that you're building might answer that one problem, but can you then, publish that out to the business users and make it accessible to them? And then as as the questions change or evolve, are those data scientists the ones that are going to maintain that application and that system and make it, something that is, continuously updated with new, technologies and everything else. And so there's been a major shift in the last few years towards this more flexible kind of app-based approach to analytics, where you still have the underlying hardcore algorithms and include optimization and simulation, again, predictive and prescriptive analytics, right, as well as new machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence and ways to comb through all the data that's there to identify trends and solve problems. But then what is happening is there's a layer that goes on top of that. Like if you've been able to consolidate the data, you can then leverage all those analytics, but then you can create a user experience that sits on top of that is more of a simple either app-based or browser-based that people are used to using, right, in a warehouse or on their in their desk or whatever to solve a specific point problem. And what we're seeing is there's this evolution towards putting those analytic solvers and those hardcore data science kind of algorithms to use for the business user, through this app-based approach.
I think I've seen that across the board in terms of, over the past few years and this focus on supply chain, user interface design, right? To make it much more intuitive, user-friendly, and really aligned with kind of the consumer applications that we use day in and day out. I mean, if we look at some of the things that we use in the consumer realm, very easy to use, but there's a lot of complexity, a lot of stuff going on in the background that, we don't see. And I think, I guess to make a simple analogy, I mean, I think that's, if I heard you right, that's kind of a similar type of thing that's going on, in the supply chain design realm, where, the approach that you take to it, the way you work with the tool, it's much more intuitive for a business user to use and be able to ask those what if questions and do the analysis, because all the complexity, if you will, which is still there, it's kind of built in it's in the background running, but doesn't necessarily need to, you don't need to go in there and do any coding yourself, if you will.
Right. So like with our, with a data model, like you bring in all of this end-to-end data from, where you're sourcing to, your manufacturing and some of the manufacturing processes and costs and, your transportation, logistics and demand. And you put that all in a model and then you have, like for us, we have a team of 30 OR PhDs that are writing these algorithms around, identifying what is the lowest cost to serve for every, SKU customer combination, or what's the ideal flow path, or, what are different ways in which you could, identify the right sourcing decision that's going to give you the lowest landed cost, right? And stuff like that. And, you're not going to give these complex modeling tools to the, if you're, a retailer, you're 50 different merchandisers, because that's not their job. Their job is to try to identify what are some unique products that they can put on the shelves, and then try to figure out ways to source, who do I source them from, and what's the, where should I offer them in the market? And they've traditionally had to use spreadsheets that are not overly accurate, or they've had to then take an idea and then run it all the way through different business units to, get their assessments on feasibility or cost. And if you have that model and it's a living model that you can go to test these things, you could really quickly build an app just through, for us, we're using the analogy of like the website builder tools that are out there. Like, I'm starting a new business and I want to have a website really quickly. I got logged into like a Wix.com or something. And I take these widgets and I drag them and I say, hey, I want to have a logo here, and I want to have my banner here, and I want to have my customer, login on this spot. And you drag and drop these little widgets onto the format of the web page, and then you hit publish, and boom, it's live, right? And underneath that is a bunch of stuff that's happening, like you said. And we've taken that same approach with our design to say, hey, you can assemble your own kind of point solutions and apps that sit on top of the data model and sit on top of the analytics. But again, the users don't have to be, advanced data scientists to use it.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I mean, if I look at even our own website, Talking Logistics, it's built on WordPress, and I am not a coder by any means, but right. I can go in there and literally within 15 minutes, I can completely redesign the look and feel of our Talking Logistics website, by adding new plugins and just dragging and dropping, different, components. And the stuff is happening in the background. I'm not
Right.
sure exactly what, but it's fairly easy for me to and intuitive for me to kind of reconfigure the website, relatively quickly and kind of see the results there quickly. So I like that analogy. So you work with a lot of different companies across a lot of different industries. Can you share some examples of how some of these leading companies are addressing emerging supply chain risks, like these proposed tariffs? How are they organized? How are they using these tools?
Yeah, I mean, there's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of examples because you see it every day. Because this is what people live, right? I think about one, last year's Gartner event. I think it was that HP, one of our customers, presented their whole, what they call business continuity planning system. And it was really two sides to it. One was first to identify all the potential risks and threats and basically sourcing all of this real-time feeds from locations all over the place, newsreels and other kinds of feeds to do a triage to kind of say, hey, based on all this information that's coming in, if I can overlay that on top of my global supply chain, a lot of these things are location-based and event-based that are, that basically might impact my business. Like for instance, lithium batteries may no longer be allowed to be airshipped or something like that. That's something that it could have a major impact. You see that news feed coming in, and it's something that might be coming in 6 months from now. Boom, that bubbles up right away. And then it takes over to the other side of the equation, which was, no, now I got to model that. I need to figure out, well, what are my alternatives? What could I do differently in my supply chain to get ahead of this before it actually happens, right? So be very proactive in nature. And I think that's one of the major things that we see as a major trend is if you have this living digital model of your supply chain, you can be proactive. You can start to anticipate, what are the most, realistic threats to my business? What is the potential impact on that? How vulnerable am I? If, like, for instance, if fuel costs go up and down by 25% in either direction, does it actually change my answer and tell me that I need to now near shore versus, offshore? Or does it just mean that maybe I have to, get a few more of my products, more local or closer to my customer? And so what you see is, companies that are really working on that living digital model, digital twin is a really good term for it that's coming out more and more these days. You have that, you've got a sandbox now. And once you have the sandbox, it's experiment, try, and then you can be reactive as well, right? When something happens that you didn't anticipate, at least you got a jump start.
You gave some great examples there, which was going to lead me to my next question. With HP, with what if you can't ship lithium batteries by air anymore, right? What if you're already seeing in the headlines. Oil I think now is up to $70 a barrel, close to 70, right? It was only a few years ago that it was above 100, and people were even talking about it going up to as high as 200.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another area. So my question was going to be, we started the conversation talking about one of the things that's in the headlines today, these tariffs and the impact
Right.
on the global trade arena. But what are some of these other what if questions that some of your customers are asking these days? You gave two examples there. Any others?
Yeah. Another example is obviously, e-commerce and same day, next day shipping. And how do you do that? How do you compete with a company with the resources and the scope of an Amazon, right? I think Michael Kors was an example of another customer of ours that presented at CSCMP last year. And what they were, talking about was, first of all, they were rapid growth for quite a few years. They were high double-digit growth, and there was always expansion plans and figuring out where do I need to add capacity and all those things. And so they got into this whole idea of modeling the supply chain and creating these models to analyze their growth. Then suddenly things kind of flattened out for them, right? And they became a more mature product in a mature market. And at the same time, the market was changing towards e-commerce, even for high fashion, which was previously not the case. And so they had all these stores, they had all this infrastructure. The first, I guess the first instinct is, hey, anytime a new order comes in, let's just fulfill it from the closest store. Let's get it to the customer. We're going to guarantee, next day service. That's great. You start to analyze what it costs to do that and actually the impact on the business, because these stores aren't set up to handle, that type of a shipment. They don't have storage and capacity in the back of the stores to even deal with inventory. And it was really clear that this was a great modeling problem. Try to figure out what is the actual right mix, right? Which ones should be fulfilled centrally, which ones should be fulfilled from stores. And you see a lot of these types of changing market conditions that are driven by demand. Other ones are simply the globalization as to markets that used to just be my low cost source are suddenly my highest growth customer markets and consumer markets, right? So your entire supply chain flips by 180 degrees, and now I'm trying to figure out ways to distribute and service as a customer base. And so a lot of the globalization, and then just pure pressure to grow as a company, right? When you're a public company, you have to grow. If you can't grow organically, if the economies aren't supporting that type of growth, then it's down to mergers and acquisitions and other things. And we see a lot of people that are trying to get ahead of validating these acquisitions and the actual rationalization that you think you're going to get, right? And the economies of scale that you think you're going to get versus what actually happens in too many cases. So using modeling to really assess those things. I think there's a ton of proactive approaches that you can take.
Those are all great examples, and the e-commerce one is one that I see a lot, these days. Just in this past year, I mean, I think there was an article in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks back, talking about P&G and how they're, undergoing a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar, basically redesign of their whole supply chain network and distribution network to try to be within one day of all their customers, right? So, that they've had to do some sort of modeling simulation to really understand, that impact and before they made that investment. And then just, I think a month ago, I was at another conference where Home Depot, same thing, doing multi-year, multi-billion-dollar, investments to redesign their supply chain network, again, in response to e-commerce and, the need to be able to ship faster, smaller quantities in a more time-definite arena, moving away from this, full truckload once a week to now LTL, parcel, direct to consumer, direct to the builder, much more much quicker time frame. So again, another example, I think it's obvious. So I would assume that they had done some modeling and simulation here to make, those types of decisions and investments. So Toby, we're running short on time here, so I'm just going to go right to my last question. As a way to wrap up, I mean, how would you complete, the following statement? Your supply chain organization will be in the best position to respond effectively to whatever changes or events occur in the future if what?
If you have a living digital model of your end-to-end supply chain that you can go to ask these questions, experiment, try things out in a relatively risk-free environment before you deploy them. It's somewhat self-serving, but it's the reality, right? I mean, if you can experiment and try things out without the risk of failure, and see what's going to happen or help predict, you're going to be in much better shape. It boils down to like the simple advice you always share. If you do your homework up front, right, you're able to respond more intelligently and quicker than if you're caught, flat-footed. I mean, that's basically what I tell, companies that I talk to, as well. If today you're asking all these what if questions, right? So what if, going back to e-commerce, right? E-commerce is about 10% of retail sales today. What if, or when retail sales reach 20% or to 30%, what will our supply chain network look like? And be able to start doing those models today, run those simulations. You at least then have some options and have thought through it that you can start making some, intelligent decisions. And same thing with these, when this whole topic of the tariffs, came up, my comment was, hey, companies have been looking at this because this was not news, right? This is news now, but this has been talked about, particularly during the election, right? That this was, if he won, if President Trump won, he was talking about these things. So if 2 years ago, companies started saying, what if, a new administration comes in? And what if a new administration decides to put tariffs? If you started doing those what if analysis 2 years ago, I think those are the companies that today are in a much better position to, respond more intelligently, more efficiently than those that are all of a sudden now trying to figure out, ask those questions. Well, Toby, like I always say, we always manage to scratch the surface on these topics, but I think we covered a lot of ground today, a lot of great insights and advice. So thank you for making the time to be with us today. I appreciate you having me.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the LlamaSoft website or on Talking Logistics, and you have a question or comment for Toby, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.